Hey, everybody. Welcome to Odd and Untold, the podcast where we talk about all things strange and spooky. And this week's episode, if you read the title, the Loveland Frogman, was sort of inspired by the t-shirt I'm wearing this week, which was given to me by my lovely girlfriend. It's the Gill Man from the movie The Creature from the Black Lagoon. And even if you haven't seen the movie, you probably recognize the creature, the Gill Man, sort of this amphibious humanoid that terrorizes his boat crew. Uh, One of my favorite movies, and I remember seeing it just as a very young kid, and probably 4 or 5. My dad and my uncle showing it to me. My uncle had this old projector, and we'd watch movies in the basement, and they were usually cut down versions of the full movie. It wasn't like the full movie, maybe like a 20-minute, 30-minute cut of the movie. But I remember even as a very young kid, there's a scene in the movie where this woman is sleeping in her bed and the creature's hand kind of comes in the window and like grabs her. And that always just freaked me out. I just hated like the thought of something touching my feet in the middle of the night while I was sleeping. But there is a cryptid, not well known, not like Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster, but it's a cryptid called the Loveland Frogman. And it was seen allegedly in Loveland, Ohio. And yeah, I just wanted to talk about that because it's one of my favorite cryptids, kind of like the Dover Demon, the Jersey Devil. You have these cryptids that are more in the realm of like folklore, and uh, there's not a lot of sightings of these things. Like Bigfoot, you can find tons of Bigfoot sightings online, but try looking for like actual Jersey Devil sightings or Dover Demon sightings aside from the original ones up in Massachusetts, and you're not really going to find many. You'll find similar stories, or you'll find references to stories, or people online will say, "Hey, I had a friend who saw the Jersey Devil," and there's really no detail. And it's very similar with the Loveland Frogman. And there was a Loveland Frogman festival just recently, and the most famous incident actually happened 53 years ago this month. So kind of relevant. And I know a lot of people who went to the festival. I couldn't go. I really can't get to a lot of these festivals. I wish I could um, get to more of them, but it's expensive to travel and airfare and hotel. And I just don't have the money, the time. But someday maybe I'll get to some of these festivals. So, yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the stories tonight, the most famous one, the most recent one, and some of the prehistory of the Loveland Frogman. And just a word of note, I did try looking for more stories. And like I said, with the Jersey Devil, with the Dover Demon, there just aren't a lot out there. A lot of what I was finding was just not uh, really valuable or worthy of even talking about here on the podcast because they were just things like a quick little note on Reddit, like, "Oh yeah, my cousin's mother saw one time," or things like that. And I don't like stories where it's just my brother's cousin's roommate. It's like a Spaceballs meme of just saw one time, and there's no detail, there's no date, there's no details, specifics. So I'm not using any of those stories. I'm just going to use stories that I could find that had some detail at least that we could talk about and analyze. And so yeah, let's dive into the Loveland Frogman for this week. All right, so this is great website that has sort of collated all the really decent stories about the Loveland Frogman, and there's not many. It's like 5 stories. And this comes to us from a site called kookscience.com, hatch.kookscience.com, and they have all sorts of alternate science things on here and cryptozoology. And they have this entry on the Loveland Frogman. And as it sounds like, it's allegedly an amphibious creature, sort of half man, half frog, or half man, half fish, or half lizard, or just something amphibious, and that's why it's got the Frogman name. I'm going to talk about some of the earlier encounters before the 1972 encounter with the 2 police officers. They're not quite frogmen, and we'll get into that and how things sort of explode and turn into something more than perhaps they are. So let us get into the gnome men, or the Gnomen, 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 and then we'll get more into the Frogman and talk about where that came from and where it leaves us today. And then a more recent encounter, which I'll analyze as I do on this channel. So let us get into the first story. So these first couple of stories come to us from like the mid to late 1950s. And this is a period in time where there was the contactees and lots of UFO sightings, and UFO craze was really gripping the world and the country. And people were seeing all sorts of things. Lots of alien sort of things, the Hopkinsville goblins and uh, robotic creatures and carrot-like creature. Like aliens just looked really, I mean, nowadays you think of an alien, you think of like the little gray alien. But back then, they had all different looks to them. They could be little goblins, they could be giant robotic sort of creatures, they could look like us, the Nordics, had like long blonde hair and blue eyes, and they looked like humans, just tall and always blonde. So I always take these stories with a grain of salt because all of these stories are just a little out there, and they could never name the person, which I understand. You want to keep people confidential, but at the same time, if nobody can follow up and verify the account, it just makes it an anecdote. It's a story, it's something to consider, but it doesn't really prove anything. It doesn't really add anything. It becomes problematic in a way. It's a double-edged sword. I get it. I'm not really falling on either side here because I do understand people wanting confidentiality and not wanting their name out there. But at the same time, I think we had a lot of authors during that time putting out books and just making up stories and saying, well, I can't tell you who told me the story, but trust me, this really happened. So the first story here, and it says here, it's our policy not to publish names in connection with many of these events. So that was just the uh, culture at the time. They didn't really name people. And this first story, 1955, apparently involved a prominent businessman who was a non-drinker, a churchgoer, and they throw these details in there to sort of, again, showed like what the skeptics always want to say, it's someone who's drunk or it's an uneducated redneck. So they're putting in here that he was a prominent businessman, a non-drinker, goes to church, and this person said he saw four strange little men about 3 feet tall under a certain bridge, and they don't mention the bridge, so something happened somewhere. So stories like this don't really impress me. And he reported the encounter to the police, and apparently an armed guard was stationed there. A similar event supposedly took place near Batavia, east of Cincinnati. Again, no details, no timing, no context. And again, this appeared in a book by Leonard Stringfield, who was one of the prolific authors at the time about UFOs and strange visitors. So stories like this I take with a grain of salt. So second encounter takes place March 1955. So another March encounter. And this also comes from a book by Leonard Stringfield. And it alleges that on a March night, doesn't say what night, about 4 a.m. in 1955, a man only known as RH was driving through Branch Hill on his way to Loveland. He says, in the beam of the headlights of his car, there appeared to be three men kneeling at the right side of the road. His first impression was that somebody was hurt or like some guys were having fun. So he stopped his car, wanted to get out and get a better look. To his surprise, he discovered the figures were non-human and about 3 feet tall. They were not green, he stressed, but rather a grayish color, including the garments. So here we're getting into almost what sounds like the typical gray alien. Very interesting. He said the garments they had were tight fitting, stretched over a lopsided chest. They had slender arms, noticeably longer than its opposite member. I guess he means the legs. He says the legs were obscured by the weeds and the brush. Their heads were ugly, said RH, reminding him of a frog's face, mostly because of the mouth, which spanned in a thin line across a smooth gray face. So here we have the big eyes, a long mouth, but a thin line. So this does sound more like the grays, but I can almost see why he's thinking frog. Frogs have these big bulging eyes. While RH thought the eyes without brows seemed normal and the nose was indistinct, the pate of the head had a painted on like hair effect, like a plastic doll. So very, very strange. He says it was corrugated, like rolls of fat running horizontally over the head. So it does almost sound like a doll. Very strange, but early days of ufology, it does sound like a gray alien. He continued by saying the middle biped, the one closest to him, was first seen with its arms upraised. They were raised a foot or so above its head, he said, and holding a dark chain or stick, which emitted blue-white sparks jumping from one hand to the other. As he approached, he said the biped lowers its arms with the chain as if to tie it around its ankles. So really weird behavior here. He said he wanted to get closer, but by the time he had reached the front fender of his car, the little men made a slight unnatural move towards him as if motioning me not to come any closer. So they sound humanoid, sound like gray aliens, but not quite what we know of today. He says for about 3 minutes, he just stood still watching them, too amazed to be afraid. And the next thing he remembers that he was on his way to the police chief's office. So Stringfield goes on to say that he was told that there had been a police investigation of this incident, that an armed guard had been temporarily assigned to the bridge, and that he learned from a member of the school board that the community that the incident had been investigated by the FBI. I don't know how true this is. So this sounds kind of like the first story. And here we get into the confusion, because the first story and this story sound almost identical. The first story, it's saying the little men were green. In the second story, they're gray. In the first story, there's 4 of them. In the second story, there's 3 of them. So is this the same encounter, just retold? Is this just 2 very similar encounters? I don't know. And that's why these older stories always kind of bother me. I don't really like a lot of this stuff from the 50s, these contactees and a lot of these alleged UFO stories or alien encounter stories. You have these overlaps, and you have, we can't say who it was, and we can't say when it was, and we can't say which bridge it happened at, but trust us, bro, this really happened. It just really rubs me the wrong way. Again, it's interesting in the grand scheme of things. It's cool to think about, but when you really drill down, there's not much there. So to address that, there was a co-investigator of Stringfield's, Ted Blocker, and he published a much more detailed version of this story. And so the RH was identified as Robert Hunnicut, a short order chef at the Loveland area restaurant at the time of his sighting. His sighting was reported to have taken place at 3:30 a.m. while Hunnicut was driving northeast on Madera Loveland Pike near Hopewell Road in Branch Hill. The incident itself was as previously described, with the addition of the detail that there was a strong and penetrating odor, which was compared to a combination of fresh cut alfalfa with a slight trace of almonds. I don't even know what alfalfa smells like. Almonds, I do. That doesn't sound entirely unpleasant, but interesting. The local police side, Chief John K. Fritz told Blocker that he had taken Hunnicutt's report and driven to the area indicated, seeking evidence, but came away with nothing concrete. Not surprising. Only a peculiar feeling in the thought that he might be the biggest fool in Loveland. So the police chief, is now thinking maybe he got taken for a ride here. And I don't blame him. Again, I think a lot of this can be chalked up to the hysteria at the time, misidentification. Though a lot of UFO reports do mention a smell. Not usually like what you hear with a Bigfoot sighting where it's like a really rotten smell. This smells like alfalfa and almonds. So it smells like a strong odor, but he's not saying it's a bad odor. So interesting that. So we get into another encounter, figures under a bridge. This is also from Ted Blocker. And it's another sighting from a 19-year-old volunteer with the local civil defense group, who apparently was crossing a bridge in the Loveland area. And he says he briefly sighted 4 small figures on the riverbank beneath the bridge, described as being more or less human-like, little men about 3 feet high. So again, we're hearing, it sounds like aliens, it sounds like gray aliens. The area, he said, was permeated by a terrible smell. So he's saying it's a terrible smell. Apparently, he also reported the incident to the local police, but the story was not taken seriously, and there was no indication that any follow-up was made. Blocker could not find any evidence that this incident had been reported to the FBI. And in the last story, again, this is just rumor that the FBI investigated. There's no proof put forward. And a lot of these stories from that time period, I'm going to say it again, just are a little sketchy to me. There's just a lot of detail left out, and the super hyper focus on what they're seeing, but they can't name the location. They can't name the person. no follow-up can be conducted because an outside investigator cannot follow up with this person and get their story told to them to make sure that it lines up. It's just put in these books and, yeah, there's dozens of different alien species coming here. So another story by Blocker, Smelly Little Man of Loveland Heights. So we're getting the smell thing again. And this one, the person was allowing him to use his name. His name was Frank White Cotton. He was the head of the Loveland Ground Observer Corps. Emily Magnone and her husband of Loveland Heights were awoken by their dog barking, at which time they noted an extremely strong and penetrating odor. So we're hearing that verbiage again, penetrate, strong and penetrating, which we heard in a different story. Odd to me that the same language is being used. I don't know if that's a cultural thing from the area or if this is the author's just way of speaking. They said it sounded like they said it smelled like a swamp, but they witnessed no other activity. So interesting. The couple were told by their next door neighbor that the neighbor had seen a little man of very strange appearance, about 3 feet tall and entirely covered by what looked like twigs or foliage. So again, we're this couple is telling this Frank person that their neighbor saw something. So we're not even getting firsthand accounts here. It's just somebody told somebody who told somebody who's then telling the author. So game of telephone here, to me anyway. But they're seeing a little man covered in what like twigs or foliage. So this almost sounds like a small Bigfoot, or I mean, they're not saying hairy, but why would a lizard or a frog be covered in twigs and foliage? So again, the neighbor said it was standing motionless about 15 feet from her porch. The neighbor put the porch light on and off several times, and it caused the being to disappear and reappear each time. I don't like these stories. These are just very strange to me, and I don't like the game of telephone here, that a neighbor told this couple, the couple told Mr. White Cotton tells Ted Blocker. How much of this is actually real? How much is exaggerated? How many blanks are being filled in here? There's nothing there saying that it looked like a frog. The only real consistency here is little man. So something small, 3 feet tall, 4 feet tall. These are not big creatures from what we're hearing. There's the smell, the strong and penetrating odor. Penetrating. I don't know many people who would use that to describe an odor, but we're seeing it here, twice in 2 different accounts. And that is a red flag for me, because again, I wonder if that's just lack of creativity on the part of the author. Who knows? All right, so now we're getting into the possibly most famous story of the Loveland Frogman. And this one is entitled Knights of the Iguana. This happened in March of 1972. So again, March. So apparently on the 3rd of March, 1972, around 1 a.m., Loveland police officer patrolman Raymond Shockey sighted something near the Little Miami River. He described the creature as having leathery skin and the face of a frog or a lizard. So Jan Goldstein, in her article, says a few weeks later, Shockey's partner, patrolman Mark Matthews, he was quoted in the newspaper article as saying he had seen the creature in the area a week after the original incident and had fired 4 shots with his .357 Magnum service revolver at a, quote, thing about 3 feet long and with a face like a frog, but he never got a close look at it as the creature hopped over a guardrail and fell into the river, washing away. The report also says that Matthews said he doesn't believe in monsters and thinks that what he saw that night was an iguana. So possibly a large iguana, not a frog man, not a cryptid. A .357 Magnum is a powerful, powerful handgun. He fired 4 shots at it. But apparently it just dropped over the guardrail and into the river and washed away, and that was the end of it. So years later, Davy Russell wrote an article for X Project magazine, and this was in 2001. And in his article, Matthews stated that the thing was, quote, obviously some type of lizard that someone had as a pet that either got too large for its aquarium, escaped by accident, or they simply got tired of it. And that while he had shot it, there was no dramatic final hop and fall into the river, only that it escaped and presumably died. So he's now saying, no frogman. It was probably a giant lizard, probably an exotic pet. Maybe not an iguana, but I'm thinking maybe like a Komodo dragon. And if you look at a Komodo dragon, that sounds kind of like what we're talking about here. And back then in 1955, people may not have realized, the average person may not know what a Komodo dragon looks like. So they're saying iguana with no tail, and it was very large. And they can be scary. Komodo dragons can get pretty big, 3 or 4 feet long, probably. And you might need a couple of shots to kill the thing. So what do you guys think? Let's move on. So then in 2016, James Legatt wrote an article for WCPO 9 in Cincinnati. Matthews told a reporter, again, in fact, he recovered the remains of a large tailless iguana and showed them to Shockey, the original person who saw them. And he says Shockey confirmed it was the creature he had seen, adding that the author of the book, Ohio Urban Legends, had misrepresented his story. Quoting Matthews, "It's a big hoax." So here we go again with this game of telephone, and authors, whether it's of a book, whether it's of a newspaper article, exaggerating the facts and trying to make something out of nothing. They're trying to sell newspapers. Yellow journalism was huge back in like the 1800s, but it's still a thing. They're still clickbait, and even back then it wasn't clickbait necessarily. They're not clicking on it, but they're buying newspapers, they're buying books. So that's why I always feel like a lot of these things are just over exaggerated to sell newspapers, to sell books. And the easiest way to do that is just make things up or exaggerate stories. And then when people ask you for verification, you say, "Oh, I can't tell you because that violates confidentiality." And it's a neat little workaround to ensure that nobody can verify the story or speak to your witness. You just put the story in a book and say they wanted confidentiality. And we all kind of have to say, yeah, I get that. But at the same time, you start seeing these red flags in these stories that it wasn't quite what people thought it was. So I'm going to get to the only real contemporary story of the Frogman. And I had blogged about this one years ago, and this is a funny one. All right, so the final story, and really the only recent one I can find anywhere, comes to us from 2016. Loveland Frogman found by Pokemon Go players. So I don't know if you guys remember this app or game on the phone, and it was trying to get people out and looking for Pokemon, which are these weird characters from a game called Pokemon. And this app would get you out into the neighborhood and into parks, and you'd have to collect these creatures. So this couple says they went out one night playing Pokemon Go and they saw the Frogman. And if you're watching on any of the formats, you can see my awesome Photoshop skills here, where I put Kermit the Frog next to the Frogman, because the Frogman, they took a picture, they took some video too. I'll throw the video in here as well in a bit, just so you guys can see the video they took, which is very dark. All you see is really are these two eyes. And the photo they took, it's been like the brightness has been enhanced, and it looks like a Frogman, but it looks completely fake, and it's got these really, really bright glowing eyes that do not look like eye shine. They look self-illuminated. So this to me looks really like a cheap hoax, but we'll get into the story. So this alleged encounter happened August 3rd, 2016. Sam Jacobs and his girlfriend were playing Pokemon Go between Loveland, Madeira Road, and Lake Isabella. They said they encountered the Frogman. And Sam says, "We saw a huge frog near the water." Jacobs wrote in an email, "Not in the game. This was an actual giant frog." So he stopped playing the game so he could document what he was seeing, snapping some photos and shooting a short video. And I'll put the photos up here. I'm going to put the video up so you guys can look at that right now. He continues, "Then the thing stood up and walked on its hind legs. I realize this sounds crazy, but I swear on my grandmother's grave, this is the truth. The frog stood about 4 feet tall." When they returned to the girlfriend's home, she wasn't named. Her parents told him about the legend of the Frogman. So he says he wasn't sure if it was the Frogman or just a big frog. He just says, either way, I've never seen anything like it. So this one is very strange to me. I'm guessing they just saw like a big bullfrog or something, or another amphibian in the water. The photo to me, it's so dark and you have to bring the brightness up to really see anything. The only thing you can really see the eyes. Same goes for the video. The video is so dark and you just see these bright, bright eyes. which look like eye shine or self-illuminated. It's hard to tell. I'm not saying they're hoaxing this. They might be. The photo itself just looks totally unconvincing. Uh, he doesn't even say frogman. He's just saying we saw a big frog, and then the family tells him about the legend of the frogman, and local media outlets pick it up, and it becomes a frogman story. And I know there's still plenty of people out there who believe that they saw the frogman, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the evidence here is not extraordinary. You guys can look at the pictures for yourselves. It looks like a fake frog. The video is not convincing. And is it a real cryptid? Like Bigfoot, there's plenty of alleged Bigfoot photos and videos out there, and none of them are really convincing, with the exception of the Patterson Gimlin footage. So I don't want to say they're lying. I'm not going to say they're lying. Either they were hoaxing, or they got hoaxed, or they just misidentified a very large frog, and it spooked them. They're out at night. They're in the woods. People get spooked. So this one does not really speak to me, if you will. All right, everyone, that's going to conclude this week's episode on the Ohio Frogman. It's an interesting legend, and people will tell you that, the Native Americans have stories of these creatures, and I don't doubt it. And I'm not saying this thing doesn't exist. Who knows? I leave the possibilities open for everything. As Captain Kirk famously said, I like to believe in possibilities, and I like to believe in possibilities. But there's nothing in any of these stories that really sways me to the side that there is something here. The story of the two police officers, I would tend to believe that more if they didn't say, hey, our story got kind of twisted, and yeah, it was basically a big iguana. We did find it. It's all a big hoax. They misquoted me. They misrepresented what I said. The books, the earlier stories of the Gnomen and the four beings or the three beings, they're green, they're gray. They can't quite get the story right. There's a lot of repetition. It just sounds very similar. It sounds like, to me, an author trying to create a pattern where there is none. The strong and penetrating odor. Who would use penetrating as a adjective for odor? It just seems a little odd. Again, not saying these things didn't happen, but I'm not convinced. I'm skeptical of the Loveland Frogman. It's a cool little story. And like I said, I do enjoy these like sort of isolated cryptid sightings, the Jersey Devil, the Dover Demon. I think they're really interesting. I think they're fascinating as far as a folklore standpoint goes, as far as a mythological standpoint goes, urban legend. They're interesting. Why do people think they see these things? And with the Dover Demon, at least, you have witnesses who were a little bit more consistent. It's a weird story, and I would like to cover it at some point. If you don't know what it is, I will link below so you guys can check out the Dover Demon. It sounds similar to the Frogman, but again, we have these isolated incidents. They're not cryptids. Maybe they're alien visitors, because a cryptid is just an unknown animal, and you would think there would be many more sightings of these things. These stories sound a little alien. They sound a little sensational, a little bit of yellow journalism, a little bit of inaccurate information, some hyperbole, some exaggeration. So it's an interesting thing to think about. It's a creepy thing to think about, a frogman coming after you, but I'm going to say no. So let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Do you believe there's a frogman, a creature from the Black Lagoon stalking Ohio? Ohio has lots of weird creatures and cryptids. I don't think frogman is among them. If you guys have any local legends, if you've seen anything weird, you want suggestions from me, what you want me to do on the show, shoot me an email, jason@oddanduntold.com, and I will get back to you. We can discuss ideas. I love these local little legends because, again, the untold part, as long as they're odd, will fit the channel. So I love these lesser known I love doing the Bigfoot stuff and the more well-known cryptids and stories, but the untold stuff is really where I'm at. And I love these local legends. I did Racetown Ray, which I'd never heard about before I started doing the podcast and doing some deeper dive research, because most of the books and most of the documentaries, they cover the same stuff ad nauseum. So I love finding these lesser known stories. So until next time, everybody, question everything, question these stories. And when you see these red flags, it's got to prick up your skeptical side, and say, why are they using the same penetrating odor? Why are they all seeing the same thing? Why is this story sound just like that story? Is it the same story? Is it just, and then if it's the same story, why are you mixing up the numbers and the colors? Like, that just doesn't sound right to me. Doesn't mean it's not true, but like I said, just pay attention to red flags, because when you have red flags, it requires deeper critical thinking. And if you like cryptids and weird things like this, we have other videos that you can check out. And we will see you next week, everybody. Rock and roll.